The hayloft air was thick with the dust of dried grasses and the chill that clung to the rafters. Amelia huddled deeper into the scratchy pile, her breath misting in the dim light filtering through cracks in the barn wall. Outside, the wind howled, a hungry wolf circling the small, lonely farmstead. Each gust rattled the aging structure, mirroring the tremors in her own body. It had been 3 days since she'd slipped in under the cloak of twilight, a phantom fleeing a past that clawed at her heels. Hunger gnawed, a dull ache that had become a constant companion. Fear, however, was sharper, a needle pricking at her sanity with every creak of the wood, every distant sound. She was a girl of 17, but the weight of the world had pressed her thin, stripped her of youthful softness, leaving only bone and a raw, exposed nerve. She listened, the rhythmic thud of footsteps below, growing louder. He was coming, the farmer. He was a man of few words, the kind whose presence filled a space more with quiet density than noise. Silas. She had only seen him from afar before she hid a tall, spare figure moving with deliberate purpose across his fields. His face weathered and unreadable, like the granite outcrops on the distant hills. He hadn't seen her slip in. She was sure of it. But the barn was small, his routine seemed absolute. Discovery was inevitable. The trap had sprung the moment she chose this desperate refuge. The trapdoor in the floor creaked open, letting in a rectangle of pale light and the scent of cold earth and wood smoke. He stood silhouetted against it, blocking the light, a large, still shape. He didn't speak. He just looked. His gaze swept the hayloft, slow, methodical. It landed on her small, trembling form half buried in the hay. Time stretched, elastic and agonizing. She wanted to disappear, to melt into the shadows, but her muscles had locked, rigid with terror. She could only stare back, her eyes wide, pleading without a sound. He held her gaze for a long moment, his expression giving nothing away. No anger, no surprise, just that same unreadable stillness. He carried a lantern, its weak glow casting long, dancing shadows that made the hayloft seem vast and menacing. Finally, a single word, low and rough, cut through the silence. Girl, it wasn't a question or an accusation, just a statement of fact, delivered with the same tone he might use to name the weather or the time of day. He didn't move closer. He just stood there, lantern held aloft, letting the silence hang heavy between them. The wind outside continued its mournful cry. The air grew colder as the heat from below dissipated. Amelia could feel the tears welling, hot and stinging, a betraying weakness she couldn't control. She blinked them back fiercely. Crying wouldn't help. Pleading wouldn't help. Nothing would help. She was cornered. She braced herself for the shouting, the questions, the inevitable turning away. Maybe worse. Stories whispered in the dust of small towns about what happened to lone women, adrift and without protection. His silence was a different kind of terror, an unknown quantity. What was he thinking? What would he do? He didn't lower the lantern. He didn't step fully into the loft. He simply waited, a statue carved from the harsh landscape he inhabited, observing the small, broken thing cowering in his hay. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. The smell of dry hay filled her nostrils, a scent she now associated only with desperation and the suffocating weight of being found. This was the end of the road. She waited for him to decide her fate. The silence stretched, measured only by the erratic thumping of Amelia's heart and the sighing of the wind outside. Silas finally lowered the lantern a fraction, its light pooling near his boots. He didn't speak again for what felt like an eternity. Then, without a word, he turned and descended back through the trapdoor. The light vanished. The trapdoor closed with a soft thud. Darkness enveloped Amelia once more, thicker and heavier than before. Relief warred with a fresh wave of panic. He had left. But why? Was he fetching something? A rope? A gun? Or was he simply leaving her there, to starve, to freeze? The uncertainty was a new torment. She remained frozen for a long time, listening. The sounds from below were muted now, a scrape of a chair, the rhythmic thud of wood being split, the occasional soft snort of the horse in the stable. Life continued, ordinary and steady, just below the floorboards where her own life hung precariously in the balance. Hours seemed to pass. The cold deepened, seeping into her bones despite the hay. Her stomach cramped with hunger. Just as despair threatened to overwhelm her completely, the trapdoor creaked open again. This time, a different kind of light spilled in, softer, warmer. It was the glow of a single candle held in a rough ceramic holder. Silas stood there again, but this time he didn't block the opening. He placed the candle carefully just inside the loft, its flame flickering. Beside it, he set down a small, dented tin plate. On the plate sat a slice of coarse bread and a piece of dried meat. A tin cup, steaming faintly, was placed next to the plate. He looked up at her then, his face visible in the candlelight, still unreadable, but the harsh lines seemed less severe in the soft glow. He didn't offer the food or the drink. He simply placed them there within her reach and then stepped back. His gaze met hers again. This time there was something different in his eyes, something that wasn't warmth but wasn't coldness either. It was observation, as if she were a creature he was studying, noting her reactions. He cleared his throat, a low sound. "Stay," he said, his voice still rough, quiet. Not a command, more like a statement of terms. No trouble. He waited a moment, watching her. Amelia stared at the food, her mouth watering, her body screaming for sustenance. But her fear kept her rooted. Was it a trick? Was he testing her? His expression remained impassive. Finally, he gave a curt nod, a minuscule movement, and turned again, closing the trapdoor once more, leaving the candle, the food, and the silence behind. She waited until the sounds from below faded into stillness. Then, tentatively, she crawled towards the light. The bread was hard, the meat tough, but she ate ravenously, tearing at it with numb fingers. The drink was warm, slightly bitter, maybe weak tea or some kind of herb infusion. It chased some of the chill from her core. The candle cast a small circle of warmth and light in the vast, cold dark. It felt like a tiny defiance against the overwhelming bleakness of her situation. He hadn't thrown her out. He hadn't alerted anyone. He had given her food. It wasn't kindness, not exactly. Felt more like a transaction. Shelter for no trouble. But it was survival. For now. She watched the candle flame, mesmerized by its steady glow in the darkness, clinging to the fragile hope it represented. Days bled into nights, marked by the farmer's routine and the slow, quiet passing of time in the hayloft. Silas would open the trapdoor at roughly the same times each day, morning and evening. He would place a plate of food and a cup within her reach, never speaking more than a word or two, usually hear or eat. Sometimes he would bring water, sometimes the warm bitter drink. He never lingered. He never asked her name. He never asked why she was there. He simply provided the bare necessities of survival, a silent, stoic presence whose predictability became the fragile framework of her new, hidden life. Amelia, in turn, learned his rhythms, the scrape of his boots on the floor below as he started his day before dawn, the clang of tools from the small workshop attached to the barn, the quiet mending of harness or sharpening of scythes directly beneath her hiding place. She learned to distinguish his movements from the sounds of the wind or the creaks of the settling wood. She stayed hidden, silent as a mouse, only daring to move when she was sure he was far from the barn. She ate the food he left, grateful for the simple sustenance, though the silence that surrounded the act felt heavy, conditional. She watched him through the cracks in the floorboards or the walls when she dared, a figure of quiet strength and solitary purpose, battling the land and the weather alone. She saw him work from sunup to sundown, saw the strain in his shoulders, the weariness in his slow gait at the end of the day. He was a man who seemed to need nothing and no one, his life a stark, uncluttered existence defined by labor and the seasons. Her fear of him began to subtly shift. It wasn't gone, but it mingled now with a hesitant curiosity, a reluctant respect for this man who had given her refuge without explanation or demand. He wasn't kind in the way others might be, with gentle words or sympathetic glances. His was a harsh, practical form of tolerance, born perhaps from a deep-seated weariness with the complexities of the world, or maybe just an aversion to unnecessary trouble. But he hadn't harmed her. He hadn't cast her out. He simply allowed her to exist within the periphery of his lonely world, a silent, hidden occupant of his barn. She started to venture out of the hayloft when he was out in the fields, down to the barn floor, stretching her cramped limbs. She would watch the horse in its stall, a gentle, solid presence. She learned where he kept the water pump, the feed. She was a ghost in his workspace, touching the rough wood of his workbench, the smooth, worn handles of his tools. These small acts of exploration, of moving freely even within the confines of the barn, were small victories against the paralysis of her fear. One evening, he left a small oilcloth-wrapped bundle with her food. Inside was a coarse, but clean, blanket and a thicker, rough-spun dress. She looked at them, then up at the closing trapdoor, but he was already gone. It was another act of silent, practical provision. The blanket brought blessed warmth against the biting cold. The dress, though too large, felt like a dignity restored, a small step away from the dirt and rags that were the remnants of her flight. She didn't understand this man. His actions seemed contradictory, remote and uncommunicative, yet offering basic necessities. It was like being cared for by the land itself, harsh and unyielding, but providing what was needed to survive if you knew where to look. This precarious, silent truce had become her reality, a fragile shelter in the storm of her past. But the storm was still out there, she knew, waiting. A week later, the relative peace of their arrangement was shattered. The farmer had been gone longer than usual, leaving shortly after dawn. Amelia, sensing his absence, had descended to the barn floor, needing to stretch her legs. She was near the large barn door, peering through a crack at the gray, overcast sky, when she heard the rumble of a wagon and the sharp voices of men. Panic seized her, cold and immediate. It wasn't Silas returning. These were other voices, louder, rougher. She scrambled back towards the hayloft ladder, her heart leaping into her throat. She hadn't made it back into the loft when the barn door was shoved open with a bang. Two men stood in the opening, silhouetted against the dreary light. They were strangers, their faces hard and suspicious. One, a burly man with a dark beard, sniffed the air. "Smell that, Cal? Like smoke. Someone's been usin' this barn." His eyes scanned the interior, missing nothing. The other man, lean and sharp-faced, noticed the faint glow of the candlewick she had left burning in its holder high in the hayloft. His eyes narrowed. "Up there, Jed. Look." Amelia froze, hidden behind a stack of old crates near the wall, praying they wouldn't see her. Her ragged breath hitched in her chest. She could hear their heavy boots on the floor, closer now. "Silas ain't got no cause to be lighting lamps in his hay," Jed grunted, approaching the ladder. "Always said he was odd, livin' out here alone. What's he hidin'?" Just as Jed reached the ladder, the barn door was suddenly blocked by a tall figure. Silas. He stood there, quiet as always, but his presence seemed to expand, filling the doorway, solid and unyielding. The two men stopped, turning towards him. "Silas," Jed said, his tone aggressive. "We were just looking around. Saw some smoke." Silas didn't answer immediately. He stepped fully inside, letting the door swing shut behind him, plunging the barn back into relative gloom, save for the faint glow from the hayloft. He was covered in mud, his clothes stained from working the back fields. He held his pitchfork, its tines sharp and menacing, though he held it casually. "My barn," Silas said, his voice low, devoid of inflection, yet it cut through the tension like a honed blade. "Nothin' here for you." "Seems like somethin' is," Kel retorted, gesturing towards the hayloft candle. "Who's up there, Silas? You got someone hidin'?" His eyes flicked towards where Amelia was hidden, as if he sensed her presence. Fear coiled in Amelia's stomach. They knew. Silas didn't flinch. His gaze met Cal's, steady and unwavering. The silence crackled. Then Silas took a slow step forward, and another, until he was standing between them and the hayloft ladder. He didn't raise the pitchfork, but its presence was felt. "I said," Silas repeated, his voice dropping even lower, a rumble that seemed to vibrate through the barn floor. "There's nothing here for you. Get out." The two men hesitated. They looked at Silas, then at each other. There was something in Silas's stillness, in the quiet intensity of his gaze, that spoke of a deep, unmovable resolve. He wasn't threatening them with words, but his stance, his presence, was a clear boundary, dared them to cross it. Jed shifted uncomfortably. Cal's eyes narrowed, but he took a half-step back. They were outnumbered, and Silas wasn't someone to be easily intimidated on his own ground. "We'll see about that, Silas," Jed muttered, but he was already backing towards the door. "The sheriff hears about strange goings. He might come a skin." "He'll find a man workin' his land," Silas replied, his voice flat. "Like always." The two men exchanged one last wary glance at Silas, then turned and exited the barn, pulling the heavy door shut behind them. The sounds of their wagon rumbling away slowly faded into the distance. Silence returned, but it was a different kind of silence now, charged with the residue of confrontation. Amelia remained hidden, trembling, listening. She heard Silas move, heard the soft scrape of the pitchfork being leaned against the wall. He didn't come towards her. He didn't speak. He simply stood there in the center of the barn floor for a long moment, a solitary sentinel. Then, slowly, he turned and walked back towards the door, opening it just enough to step outside, leaving her alone once more. He hadn't exposed her. He had defended her presence, not with explanation, but with quiet, unyielding force. The implications settled over her, heavy and unexpected. Amelia slowly emerged from behind the crates, her legs unsteady. Her heart was still pounding, but beneath the fear, a different emotion stirred, a bewildered sense of protection. Silas had stood against those men. He had defended her right to be hidden here, precarious as that right was. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was definitive. He had drawn a line. Later that evening, when Silas came with her food, he looked at her directly. He didn't speak of the men or the confrontation. He simply placed the plate down, the candle beside it. But this time, instead of turning away immediately, he lingered for a moment. His gaze was assessing, searching. "They'll talk," he said, his voice low. "Folks always talk." It was a simple statement of fact, acknowledging the reality outside their isolated bubble. Amelia finally found her voice, a rough whisper from disuse. "Thank you." He didn't react to her words. He just continued to look at her. The candle flame reflected in his eyes, making them seem deep and unfathomable. He saw the dirt on her clothes, the fear still etched on her face, the vulnerability that clung to her like a shroud. But perhaps he saw something else too. Resilience, the stubborn refusal to break, despite everything. He reached out slowly, his calloused hand moving towards her. Amelia flinched instinctively, bracing herself, but he didn't touch her. His hand stopped, hovering for a brief instant, then moved past her face to gently adjust a loose strand of hay near her head. He didn't say anything. It was the closest he had ever come to a gesture of something. Not tenderness, but maybe a recognition of her presence, her physical reality in his space. He drew his hand back. "Winter's coming," he said, looking not at her, but at the rough wood of the hayloft walls. "It'll be colder, harder." It wasn't a question about her plans. It was a simple statement about the future, about the inevitable challenges ahead. But implied within it was an acknowledgement of her continued presence, a quiet acceptance that she was still here and would likely remain. It wasn't an invitation, but it wasn't a dismissal either. It was the laying out of facts. The hayloft would be colder, survival would be harder, and she was still in his barn. Amelia understood. The silent agreement had just expanded subtly, irrevocably. She was no longer just a temporary, hidden problem. She was here, in his life, and the world outside, the world that wanted to find her, would keep looking. Their fragile, unspoken partnership, born of necessity and silence, had just deepened. It wasn't a fairy tale ending, not even close. It was two damaged, solitary people finding a quiet, necessary alliance against a harsh world. It was resilience forged in isolation, a quiet strength rising in the face of overwhelming odds. The future was uncertain, filled with potential threats, but for the first time in a long time, Amelia didn't feel entirely alone facing it. She looked at Silas, this quiet, formidable man, and a fragile seed of hope, tough and tenacious like a weed pushing through stone, began to sprout in the barren landscape of her heart.